It is June 28, 1919. The Hall of Mirrors in the Palace of Versailles, France. Crystal chandeliers hang from the ceiling. Gold reflects off every surface. Allied leaders sit at long tables, dressed in their finest. And on the other side of the room, two German delegates walk in, not as equals, not as negotiating partners, but essentially as prisoners being told their sentence. What they signed that day was called the Treaty of Versailles, and what it did to Germany would set the entire stage for everything that followed. The treaty forced Germany to accept full and complete responsibility for starting World War I. This single clause, Article 231, what historians would later call the War Guilt Clause, was not just a legal formality. It was a public humiliation written into international law. Germany lost 13% of its territory. It lost 10% of its entire population overnight. Its military was gutted. The army capped at 100,000 men. No air force allowed. Its navy reduced to almost nothing. And then came the reparations. The Allied powers demanded Germany pay 132 billion gold marks, the equivalent of roughly $33 billion at the time, for a war that Germany's own people believed was not entirely their fault. Think about what that means for a moment. You are a German citizen in 1919. You just lived through 4 years of trench warfare. You lost brothers, fathers, sons. Your country is exhausted. And now you are being told, officially, legally, in writing, that everything that happened was your fault. You owe money you do not have. You have an army that cannot protect you. And your elected government, the new Weimar Republic, signed it all. For millions of Germans, the treaty did not feel like peace. It felt like a second punishment. After the first punishment of losing the war, the economy collapsed. Hyperinflation hit so badly that by 1923, Germans were carrying wheelbarrows full of cash just to buy a loaf of bread. Then the Great Depression arrived in 1929 and destroyed whatever remained. Unemployment exploded, savings vanished, families went hungry, and into that darkness, into that anger, that shame, that desperation, walked a man with very simple promises. He told Germans that they had been stabbed in the back. He told them they had been betrayed. He told them that Germany could be great again. His name was Adolf Hitler. Hitler had fought in World War I as a corporal, and the defeat had shattered him personally. He genuinely believed Germany had been betrayed by Jews, by communists, by weak politicians who surrendered when they should have fought. When he discovered he had a talent for public speaking, he turned that personal rage into a political weapon. He joined a small nationalist party in Munich in 1919, and within a few years had transformed it into the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the Nazis. His first attempt at seizing power failed. In 1923, he led what became known as the Beer Hall Putsch, a failed coup attempt in Munich that got him arrested and sentenced to prison. But prison gave him time to write. He wrote Mein Kampf, a book that laid out his entire worldview with almost terrifying clarity. He was not hiding anything. He wrote openly about German racial supremacy, about the need for more living space for the German people, about his hatred for Jewish people, about his intention to tear apart the Versailles Treaty. The book was published and widely read. The world had every warning it needed, and the world looked away. By 1933, with the Depression at its worst and the Weimar government paralyzed, Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany through a combination of political maneuvering, public popularity, and backroom deals. Within months, he had dismantled Germany's democratic institutions entirely. He consolidated power. He eliminated opponents, some imprisoned, some murdered. He became Führer, supreme leader, answerable to no one. And then, step by step, he began doing exactly what he had written in that book. He started rebuilding Germany's military, in open violation of the Versailles Treaty. He reintroduced conscription in 1935. He unveiled a brand new air force, the Luftwaffe. He sent troops into the Rhineland in 1936, a demilitarized zone that the treaty had specifically forbidden Germany from occupying. The world watched. Britain and France protested mildly. And then they did nothing. Every time the world failed to act, Hitler grew bolder. He had figured something out that the Allied leaders had not yet understood. They did not want another war badly enough to stop him, and he was willing to use that. This is perhaps the most painful part of the entire story, because World War II was not inevitable. There were moments, real and documented moments, where it could have been stopped. In 1936, when German troops entered the Rhineland, Hitler's own generals were nervous. Hitler later admitted that if France had pushed back militarily, Germany would have had to retreat immediately. The German military was not yet strong enough to fight a full war. But France did not act. Britain did not act. In 1938, Hitler annexed Austria, a country of 6.5 million German-speaking people, through political pressure and the threat of military force. The world condemned it. Nothing happened. Then Hitler set his sights on the Sudetenland, a region of Czechoslovakia with a large German-speaking population. He demanded it. And in September 1938, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain flew to Munich and sat across from Hitler and agreed to hand over the Sudetenland in exchange for Hitler's promise that this would be his last territorial demand. Chamberlain flew back to London and stood before cameras waving a piece of paper, declaring that he had achieved peace for our time. 6 months later, Germany occupied the rest of Czechoslovakia. The paper meant nothing. The promise meant nothing. And now it was too late to pretend otherwise. The policy of appeasement, giving Hitler what he wanted to avoid confrontation, had not bought peace. It had bought Hitler time, resources, and confidence. By the spring of 1939, the question was no longer whether Hitler would push further. The question was where and when. Poland was next. Hitler wanted it for multiple reasons: territory, resources, and a geographical position that mattered enormously for his larger ambition. Britain and France, finally understanding what appeasement had cost them, publicly guaranteed Poland's borders in March 1939. If Germany attacked Poland, they declared, they would go to war. Hitler believed they were bluffing, or perhaps did not. What he needed first was to ensure that if he invaded Poland from the west, the Soviet Union would not attack Germany. So he made a deal with the one man most people would have assumed was his greatest ideological enemy, Soviet leader Joseph Stalin. On August 23, 1939, Germany and the Soviet Union signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, a non-aggression agreement. Hidden within it, in a secret protocol that would not be publicly confirmed for decades, was something even more sinister: a plan to divide Poland. Two dictators, ideologically opposed, had quietly shaken hands over a map of a sovereign country. When news of the pact broke across Europe, capitals went into shock. The one thing that could have protected Poland from Germany, the threat of a Soviet response, had been neutralized overnight. Hitler now had what he needed. On August 31st, 1939, at exactly 12:40 in the afternoon, he gave the final order. German forces were to begin the invasion of Poland at 4:45 the following morning, September 1st, 1939. Before the sun had fully risen over Poland, German tanks crossed the border in a coordinated assault from the north, south, and west simultaneously. It was a new kind of warfare, fast, overwhelming, mechanized, what the Germans called blitzkrieg or lightning war. The Polish military fought with extraordinary courage, but they were facing something they had never encountered before. Within hours, German aircraft were bombing Polish cities. Within days, the front lines were collapsing. 2 days later, on September 3rd, 1939, Britain and France made good on their promise. At 11:15 in the morning, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain addressed the nation on the radio. His voice was tired, older somehow than it had been just months before. He told his country that because Germany had not withdrawn its forces from Poland, Britain was now at war with Germany. France declared war that same afternoon. Within weeks, Soviet troops invaded Poland from the east, just as the secret protocol had planned. Poland, caught between two powers with a combined military that dwarfed its own, fell in less than a month. But even as Warsaw surrendered, the map of the world was already being redrawn. The war that had started in Poland would not stay in Poland. It never does. By the time it was over, 6 years and roughly 60 to 80 million deaths later, almost every country on the planet had been pulled in. Cities that had stood for centuries were reduced to rubble. A Holocaust had murdered 6 million Jewish people, along with millions of others. Roma, disabled individuals, political prisoners, and more. 2 atomic bombs had been dropped on Japanese cities for the first time in human history. The entire political geography of the planet had been remapped, and it all traced back to that hall in Versailles in 1919. Back to the moment a group of victors decided to punish a defeated enemy instead of building a sustainable peace. Back to a veteran sitting in a Munich prison, writing a book that nobody took seriously enough. Back to leaders who chose to appease a threat instead of confronting it, hoping each compromise would be the last. Back to a secret pact signed in August between 2 men who would eventually go to war with each other anyway. World War II was not an accident. It was the result of decisions, real, documented human decisions, made by real people who had the power to choose differently. That is not meant to reduce the horror of it. It is meant to emphasize something important, that the conditions that produced it, resentment, economic desperation, the seductive appeal of a strong man who promises to restore greatness, and the dangerous habit of hoping a problem will go away if you ignore it long enough. Those conditions are not unique to 1930s Germany. They are conditions that can exist anywhere, in any country, in any era. That is what makes the beginning of World War II worth studying, not just as history, but as a warning.